Darren Cole thought his words would protect him. Blake Rayner knew they could destroy him. But in the end, it was Darren's voice, and Blake's own mistakes, that exposed a chilling truth hidden in plain sight. Mason Hollow was the kind of town people passed through without ever really seeing. Nestled between stretches of pine forest and winding country roads, it seemed frozen in time. The main street was dotted with mom-and-pop stores, a single diner, and a gas station that still used analog pumps. Crime was so rare that even petty theft made front-page news in the local paper. People felt safe in Mason Hollow because they trusted each other. They left their front doors unlocked, handed over spare keys to neighbors, and raised their children together. But that sense of security shattered the morning Darren Cole didn't show up to work. Darren was a local handyman, the kind of person everyone in town called when a faucet leaked or a fence needed mending. He was reliable, polite, and known for never turning down a job. When he missed a scheduled appointment with Mrs. Whitmore, an elderly woman he helped every Tuesday, people were concerned but not alarmed. By day 2, concern turned into worry. By day 3, people feared the worst. That evening, his truck was found parked in his driveway. The doors were locked, the keys were gone, and there was no sign of a struggle. But Darren was nowhere to be found. The search began that night. Volunteers combed the woods behind his home with flashlights and dogs. Police drones scanned the dense tree lines, but nothing surfaced until the afternoon of the 4th day. It was a local teenager who found him, a boy who had wandered off the trail looking for cell signal. Darren's body lay face down near a shallow stream, hidden by fallen branches. The sight was gruesome. A head wound suggested blunt force trauma, and there were bruises along his arms and neck. His shoes were missing, and his phone wasn't on him. The town went into collective mourning. Candlelight vigils lined the steps of City Hall. Social media pages flooded with photos, memories, and prayers. No one understood how something so violent could happen to someone like Darren. There were no suspects, no witnesses, and no immediate leads. Everyone asked the same question: why him? Police initially treated it as an isolated incident. Maybe it was a robbery gone wrong. Maybe a drifter passing through. But nothing about Darren's death made sense. Nothing was stolen. There were no defensive wounds. The medical examiner's report later confirmed that Darren had died just hours before he was found, suggesting he had been held somewhere before being killed. The absence of clear answers created a vacuum filled with fear and rumors. Whispers of hidden enemies, secrets, and betrayal began spreading. The image of Mason Hollow as a peaceful town started to crack. And behind the quiet grief of a community was a darker truth. Someone among them was hiding something. Darren's death wasn't random. It was calculated. And as police would soon learn, the path to his killer wasn't hidden in fingerprints or witnesses. It was buried in words Darren had left behind. After Darren's funeral, the shock still lingered in Mason Hollow like a fog no one could clear. People tried to return to their routines, but something felt off. The streets were quieter, smiles were shorter, and doors that had once been left open were now locked tight. Behind closed curtains, residents whispered theories. Was it a stranger who had wandered into town? Or someone who had been here all along, blending in unnoticed? The police had little to go on, but one piece of Darren's life stood out: his blog. It wasn't something most people knew about. Titled Woods of Secrets, it was tucked away on an obscure website, mostly read by hobby bloggers and online drifters. At first glance, it seemed like harmless creative writing. Darren had posted weekly, sometimes more, describing his hikes in the forest, thoughts about solitude, and oddly, cryptic reflections about being watched. His posts were vague, sometimes poetic, filled with imagery of shadows in the trees and unsettling silences. But one entry, dated 3 weeks before his death, caught investigators' attention. In that post, Darren wrote about a presence that followed him, someone who never spoke, but who always seemed one step behind. He wrote about seeing the same figure on different trails, and once, spotting footprints near his backyard that didn't match his own. He ended the post with an eerie line: I used to walk these woods for peace. Now, I walk faster. At first, detectives thought it might be part of a fictional narrative. But that idea began to unravel when a reader from another town contacted police. She claimed to have exchanged several emails with Darren over the past 2 months. He had reached out to her after she left a comment under one of his posts about stalkers. In those emails, Darren sounded different, nervous, even paranoid. He told her he believed someone close to him was watching him. He said he was collecting evidence but didn't want to go to the police until he was certain. He never mentioned names, only referred to the person as he. In one message, Darren wrote, "I think he knows I'm onto him. If anything happens to me, it's not random." The emails painted a picture far more serious than a writing exercise. Investigators began treating the blog not as fiction, but as Darren's digital diary, his way of expressing fears he wasn't ready to say out loud. They went back through his posts, searching for clues. One entry described a trail Darren had stopped walking because he was always there. Another described how his back gate had been left open one morning, something Darren never did. In a later post, Darren wrote, "He's not just watching anymore. He's waiting." Suddenly, Darren's writing wasn't just strange. It was evidence. And hidden within his metaphors and cautious phrases was a warning no one had understood. Until it was too late. He hadn't imagined the fear. He hadn't been paranoid. He had been hunted. And somewhere in those lines, police believed, was the first breadcrumb that would lead to the truth.as detectives dug deeper into Darren's online life. They began to cross-reference names, usernames, and IP addresses linked to his blog and email activity. The investigation was slow, but one name kept surfacing in connection with comments, page visits, and even search history logged through Darren's public posts: Blake Rayner. A lifelong resident of Mason Hollow, Blake had grown up just 3 blocks from Darren. They had gone to the same high school, played on the same little league team, and even worked together briefly after graduation. On the surface, Blake was unremarkable. He kept to himself, worked part-time at the local hardware store, and spent most of his free time at the public library. But Blake's name had never come up during the initial round of questioning after Darren's death. That changed when a librarian named Julie Maddox reached out to police with something she'd found unsettling. Over the past 2 months, Blake had checked out several books about criminal psychology, forensic techniques, and digital footprints. She had thought it was strange, but harmless, until she heard about Darren's blog and the odd entries he had posted. She remembered Blake asking her one day how deleted files on phones could be recovered. When she asked why, he said he was just curious. That single tip shifted the entire investigation. Detectives obtained a warrant to examine Darren's cloud accounts, digging through backups that hadn't been accessed in weeks. Buried in an obscure folder of audio files was something unexpected: a voice memo titled "For When I'm Gone.mp3. The file had been created just 8 days before Darren's death.in it. Darren's voice was calm but serious. He described his growing fear of someone watching him and how he had started noticing Blake in unusual places: outside his house at night, sitting alone at the diner across the street, appearing on trails Darren used to consider private. He said Blake had changed recently, growing quieter, but also more intense in the way he stared and listened. Darren spoke about one encounter that chilled investigators the most: the night he caught Blake outside his bedroom window. Darren hadn't confronted him. Instead, he turned off the light and waited. The next morning, a note had been left in his mailbox. It read, "You write too much." What stood out was how Darren spoke of the feeling of being cornered, not physically, but psychologically. He said Blake had started asking questions about his writing, trying to understand what he had posted. Darren believed Blake feared exposure and was trying to control the narrative by intimidating him. The memo ended with a haunting line: "If anything happens to me, look at Blake. He's the one who knows how this story ends." For detectives, it was the first concrete link between Darren's death and another person. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Darren had named someone, his old friend, and now the case had a direction. But what no one yet realized was that Blake had left his own trail too, hidden not in words said out loud, but in digital mistakes and the one thing he thought he could control, his silence. With Darren's voice memo pointing squarely at Blake Rayner, investigators moved swiftly. They obtained a warrant to search Blake's home and personal devices, hoping to uncover something that would tie him directly to the crime. Blake still hadn't been named publicly as a suspect, and he remained calm during casual follow-ups, never deviating from his story, that he hadn't spoken to Darren in months and had no idea about the blog or emails. But inside his small, cluttered house, hidden behind locked drawers and buried in folders on his laptop, was a trail of evidence more revealing than any confession. In his bedroom closet, tucked behind a stack of boxes, officers found a dark green hiking backpack that matched the one Darren was known to carry. Inside were items Darren's family recognized immediately: his missing thermos, a worn notebook with sketches, and a glove stained with dried blood. The glove was tested, and DNA confirmed it belonged to Darren. The most chilling item in the bag, though, was a torn page from Darren's private journal, the same journal he used for thoughts he never published. The page detailed fears about someone too familiar, too close, watching him, and it ended abruptly, almost mid-sentence. More damning evidence came from Blake's laptop. Investigators discovered a folder hidden inside a subdirectory named School Docs, which contained drafts of emails and blog posts. What was shocking was that these were written as if Darren had authored them. The contents suggested despair, hints of suicidal thoughts, and an intention to disappear from the world. Police believe Blake had written these drafts to post after Darren's death in an effort to fake a suicide narrative. But in one of the drafts, a careless error changed everything. Blake had copied and pasted a quote from one of his favorite books, an obscure line only those close to him would recognize. Embedded in the document's metadata was a name, B. Rayner. It was a simple mistake, a technical oversight, but it unraveled the illusion he had worked so hard to build. Investigators now had not only a motive to silence Darren before he revealed something, but also the means and opportunity. Blake had stalked Darren, inserted himself into his daily life under the radar, and planned a narrative that would cover his tracks. But he hadn't counted on Darren leaving behind digital footprints of his own. More searches uncovered browsing history that included phrases like how to spoof IP addresses, ways to stage a suicide, and deleting phone data permanently. The irony was impossible to ignore. Blake, who had studied how criminals got caught, had become a perfect case study himself. The pieces fell into place one by one. Darren's fear wasn't irrational. His instincts had been right. And the person he had once called a friend had become his shadow, silently rewriting the story from behind a screen. But Blake had failed to understand that even silence tells a story. And in trying to erase Darren's voice, he had only made his own louder. Blake Rayner's arrest came quietly. Officers approached him outside the hardware store where he worked, placing him in handcuffs as the afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared straight ahead as if he'd been expecting this moment. By the time the news broke, the town of Mason Hollow was already bracing for the wave of disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the quiet man they thought they knew with the cold, calculated behavior revealed by the investigation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the case was about to reach its most revealing stage. In court, the prosecution presented their case with chilling precision. Darren's voice memo was played for the jury in full, echoing through the courtroom like a message from the grave. The jurors listened in silence as Darren described the fear, the stalking, and his belief that Blake was behind it all. The emotional weight of his words was undeniable. His voice was calm, but beneath it was something haunting, an acceptance that he might not survive what he was facing. The jury also saw the digital evidence. They were shown the fake blog drafts Blake had written, his internet searches, and the metadata that tied the documents directly to him. They learned how Blake had planned to manipulate the narrative after Darren's death, creating a false trail of depression and hopelessness. But it wasn't just what he tried to hide that sealed his fate. It was the things he left behind without realizing. The quote from his favorite book, the embedded name, the timeline that didn't add up. His own words, crafted so carefully to mislead, had become the very tools that exposed him. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when the forensic expert testified that Blake had used a computer program to mimic Darren's writing style. He had studied Darren's past posts, replicating sentence structures and favorite phrases. It was methodical, almost obsessive. But what Blake couldn't replicate was Darren's voice, the subtle emotion, the rhythm of his thoughts, the underlying sincerity that made his real writing stand out. The jury saw the difference, and they felt it. The trial lasted just under 2 weeks. Blake never took the stand. His silence was his final attempt to control the narrative, but by then, the truth was already speaking louder than he ever could. The verdict came quickly, guilty on all counts. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the sentencing, Darren's blog was archived and turned into a memorial site. Visitors from across the country began reading the posts he once wrote in near anonymity. What had once been dismissed as fictional rambling was now recognized as a trail of warning signs. Breadcrumbs left behind by someone trying to protect himself with the only weapon he had, his words. Blake had believed he was smarter, that he could script a perfect ending. But in the end, it wasn't Darren's silence that betrayed him. It was Blake's need to write the last word. And that final word became the one that took him down.